Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have really a great session and an amazing panel of experts to provide their perspective on how real-world data can not only reduce patient burden, but also improve outcomes. So go into our list of speakers. My name is Tyler Pugsley, Vice President of Life Sciences at Medable. I will be moderating the panel discussion, but again, really looking forward to this. I think there's some really key aspects that we can focus on to not only improve that patient experience, but then also capture more accurate, true-to-life data throughout the process. Next, I'll turn it over to Chris from AbbVie.
Chris Boone, Vice President and Global Head of Health Economics and Outcomes Research at AbbVie. Devin?
Yeah. And Devin.
Hey, everybody. Thanks, Tyler. Thanks, Chris. Devin Gillum. I'm on the clinical trials team here at Datavant, where I focus on leveraging our health data linking products to bring real-world data into clinical studies for life sciences, CROs, academic researchers. Thanks, Medable team, for having me here today. I think the conversations leading up to this webinar have been super enjoyable, and a lot of new ideas from all these groups, have sort of bubbled up for how we can continue to collaborate together in new ways. So looking forward to the discussion today. Artie?
Happy Wednesday, everyone. From San Diego, California, I'm Artie Ariyampur, CEO and founder of Seekster. Really excited to have this discussion with all our partners here, Medable, AbbVie, Datavant. Couldn't be more thrilled. Looking forward to kicking off the summer here shortly with this great lineup and learning something new from everyone that's speaking today. So thanks again, Medable, for sponsoring this, and it's a pleasure being here.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And, Chris, could you help us, frame the problem that we're looking to solve here and explain or really provide, your experience and expertise to, the current landscape?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I think we all recognize that finding new drugs and bringing them to market is extremely challenging in this environment. On average, it takes roughly 14 years and $2.6 billion to take a drug to market for most of the pharma companies. But the risky part of that is less than 10% of those therapies that actually enter human trials make it to the actual pharmacy for the patient. So it's an extremely risky business, and we recognize that the current sort of clinical trial approach may not be the most sustainable and scalable way to achieving that. But there are other challenges that I want to bring to your attention that we can skip to the next slide, please. As you think about this situation and primary challenges for patients and even investigators, when we think about the current clinical trial model and how real-world data could actually be certainly a game changer in this respect, is that if you look at it, 54% of current clinical investigators participate in just one research study, and then they never participate in it again. There's a number of reasons for it. Some of it has to do with just the sort of intensity and demands that are placed on them when it comes to some of the clinical studies. There are others who probably feel as though just demands of their actual clinical practice supersede their ability to be actually participated in some of these key clinical studies that we're interested in. Another thing is that less than 5% of patients actually participate in clinical research, which obviously affects our ability to really diversify, the participants in clinical trials, which I know has been one of the sort of key drivers as of late, is diversity in clinical trials and representation generally of the general population. But then for those that do actually actually sign up and become part of a clinical trial, 49% of those patients actually drop out before study completion. Which actually is another thing that affects our ability to hit those targets. And then if you think about the next factoid we have up here, 48% of those trials miss enrollment targets. So on one hand, you have 48% of the trial sites missing enrollment targets. You have 49% of those people who actually sign up actually dropping out before study completion. And then you layer in the last fact here that the average distance from a patient living from the nearest site is roughly 50 miles. So I think that you can see the extent of the situation that we have, but then, and then you really, as you think about like what challenges does that create for many of the sponsors or the pharma companies in this case, it affects our ability to do rapid recruitment. It affects our ability to diversify the sort of participant population or the patient population in these studies. It becomes extremely hard to recruit specific subpopulations that are, that are most affected or where the prevalence rates are highest for particular clinical conditions. We obviously have this issue with patient retention, which affects our ability to hit, those enrollment targets or even those timelines that we set out, which then affects speed to market and our ability to get access to those therapies to many of the patients that are suffering the most. And then you have this escalating sort of exponential growth and the cost that it takes to run many of these studies as we know it. So as you can imagine, this situation, these challenges create an environment that makes it a bit unsustainable to continue with the clinical trial model as we know it today. We've been running clinical trials the same way for the last several decades even, and we've seen significant technological advances that I think, or that I'm actually rather confident, could actually be game changers and allow us to do these things much better than we do today. So I'm going to kick it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. So, now we understand the challenges in the current landscape, and really our goal at Medable is to really make research accessible for any participant, anytime, anywhere, on any device. So by providing that accessibility, whether it's through the mobile application or the web, simple, easy to access e-consent, which obviously patients consenting is a critical component of any trial. But then through that consent, we also link with our partners, Seekster and Datavant. So Artie, would you like to talk about Seekster here?
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. With Seekster, it's all about seeking health data, and I think Chris Boone just did a great job, outlining the main pain points that pharma sees, and we've been hearing this for a long time. I think the problem has gotten bigger, and the only reason it's gotten bigger and it's front and center now is because data is just being siloed more. It's hard to get longitudinal data. And so we pioneered patient-centric interoperability where, it's one foundational technology that can be either white labeled or through our SDK, having obviously Datavant integrated for the tokenization and de-identification of data is super important. And I'm sure Devin will talk more about Datavant's part. But with Seekster, think of us kind of like as being Switzerland, and having various different integrations and being able to bring in real-time data from nationwide scale access on the EMR, EHR side, wearables, as well as medical devices, and not limiting to genomic data, clinical diagnostic tests, and social determinants of health, and pharmacy RX data, and even claims data. So how do you really put together a 360 patient view and bring that data in real time? This is what Seekster has really pioneered, and we're just so excited that finally the industry is looking for solutions that can be combined into one, and we're just grateful to be partnered, Tyler, with you and Medable for this initiative on the decentralized trials and how the streamlining of the e-consent happens. But without data, without bringing in that high fidelity, high quality, real world data that everyone is looking for both the patient and also for the enterprise, what are we really talking about, right? And so we're really focused at just empowering both patients and enterprises in a secure way to aggregate all that data in a longitudinal health record.
So I can speak to the Datavant piece a little bit and how it all fits in. So Datavant's mission is to connect the world's healthcare data to improve patient outcomes. And one of the most important areas for us to be connecting data is probably clinical trials. So even given the most meticulously designed studies, which make clinical trial data some of the most robust healthcare information out there, there can still be a lot of gaps in the information. So Chris pointed out on the last slide that nearly half of patients are dropping out. And I think when we start to think about decentralized trials, a lot of folks are waving their hands and saying there's this issue of data missingness. So Datavant is there to sort of solve some of those issues. And fundamentally, we're trying to break silos between what's traditionally classified as real-world data, real-world evidence, and what's thought of as clinical trial data. Because there's so much additional insight that you can gain by actually linking those, these types of data sets together. So if as Artie just said, the Seekster piece is to start with the patient and go deep to get real data depth. I think the Datavant piece is super complementary in that what we're doing here is extending the breadth of the types of data that we can pull in. So utilizing our ecosystem of real-world data from our data sources and data partners, we can pull in very specific real-world data that might be coming from EHRs, from claims, from labs, from genetic test results, et cetera. And why this is all important kind of under the Medable umbrella is that we're sort of wrapping up a number of offerings into one nice solution. So that patients can be consented. Datavant Seekster can go out, bring in the additional data to understand the trial results, and then that can sit within the Medable platform and for nice analysis.
Great. Thank you so much, Devin and Artie. So, now we're going to go into a few different example case studies or use cases and really kind of frame this around, some questions and be able to explain, how we can actually put this in place, for these different case studies. So whether this is in the trial setting, for registries, or for health economic outcomes research. And then also I would welcome the audience to also include questions kind of as we're going through here. If you have any questions, burning questions, you'd really love to get answers. I think we have a very experienced panel that can hopefully provide those that you need. So starting off, this is to Chris. So I think everybody recognizes that over the past 12 to 18 months, we've really seen decentralized and digital trials really go much more from a edge case to a main case, and really kind of being that new frontier of patient research. How do you think, or how do you see that this is actually changing the individual participant experience? Actually, not only participant experience, but also for really the entire research ecosystem.
No, it's a very fair question. For the participant, you think that if we start to, I guess, for lack of better terms, decentralize the trial, and you're really addressing this issue around access, which I think is the sort of cornerstone issue that you have with many of these patients. You have patients who live in rural communities, you have patients who live in areas of the country or the world that are not necessarily designated or preferred clinical trial sites. And so I think that the ability to sort of build in the access to so many of the technologies that that you guys have highlighted today, as well as furthermore bridge sort of the gap between direct clinical care and clinical research, I think you're starting to address sort of certainly multiple issues at once. I think certainly from the sponsor or pharma perspective, it does allow us to address many of the pain points that we indicated earlier. But I think the sheer fact of engaging better with the patient and having that patient voice and increasing the patient experience and better understanding sort of those patient-reported outcomes so that we can better design our studies, better develop clinical endpoints that will be relevant, to not just to not just the regulators or even to the payers, but also and providers, but to the patients as well. You really start to find yourself closing sort of the feedback loop that exists within that ecosystem. So I think as we start to increase, and another key thing that I think is important that gets lost on people at times is really the contextualization of the data, right? I mean, when you start to get into contextualization and generalizability, you really start to understand the environments that many of the patients actually reside in that ultimately affect their sort of clinical condition and thus clinical outcomes. So I think the more that we can start to understand the patient experience, the patient environment, and understand sort of, I think we'll also better understand how that affects patient outcomes and how and why certain patients respond or they don't respond to certain treatments and therapies. And that is what's going to really ultimately be a game changer for the system.
Absolutely. And, in your perspective and really, across the industry, do you see that technology can actually increase not only the amount of data captured, but also improve the quality of that data?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we're banking on. I don't think that, I think the sort of sophistication of the technologies and the sort of data collection or data curation capabilities is happening as we speak. I think where I think the greatest challenge for all of us is how do we start thinking of novel questions that we've never asked before? I think the thing that I find very interesting is that we're getting access to more data than we've ever seen before, right? But yet we're still asking some of the very rudimentary questions that we've asked 10 years ago, right? And I think that, so at some point, you just hope that the sort of, human intellect or our ability to really think of novel questions catches up with the pace of the data that we're actually curating through all of these very advanced digital technologies that are out there. And a lot of that is rooted in our ability to really, you almost got to think outside the box, which is challenging at times for people who've done things a certain way. But I commend, I actually commend the regulators for really driving the level of innovation in this space that more so than we've ever seen before. And hopefully that continues. But I also think that as an industry, we have to start to think of new ways of doing things. And that requires partnering with many of the companies like yours that are capturing much of this data and helping us understand, different use cases where we can apply this data that we've never thought of before.
Great. That's a great segue to our next question. As an industry, and really overall within the entire trial ecosystem, we're moving into utilizing data sources, new technology. What do you think we're still missing? When we look to achieve kind of the full potential of these multiple different tools that we have access to now.
Clear use cases. I mean, I think that I was having a discussion with someone earlier today. I think that we can curate as much data as we want. We can develop, or you guys can develop as many digital technologies as you want. But until we start to sort of kind of go along those lines of case studies that you have in the right column here, and really start to think of our work differently and what problems we're really trying to solve, we won't fully maximize the value of those newer technologies and this newer data capture that we're seeing. So I think that at some point we're going to have to pull ourselves out and say, okay, we know that the system is seeing these challenges, as we just discussed earlier. That's just a fraction of the challenges that we see as part of the system. But how effectively can we address those challenges with these newer technologies, with these newer data sets that we're seeing? And so I really think the thing that we're lacking is really innovative use cases for these various technologies and these various data types.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So this next question, we'll go to Artie. So, how is actual historic health data gathered today? And then, Also maybe you want to touch on, this came from the audience, some of those data sources.
Yeah, look, I think one thing that's really important, and it actually relates to a lot to what just Chris at AbbVie alluded to around the patient engagement, the patient journey. The patient has been neglected, for a very long time. Let's all take our company hats off, Medable, AbbVie, Datavant, Seekster. At the end of the day, you're Tyler, I'm Artie, you're Chris, you're Devin, and we're people. At the end of the day, we're people, we're consumers, and then we become patients at some point in our lifetime. And what we've learned a lot about, this is that the patient needs to be at the center of their healthcare. And now by providing them, access to all their health data and enabling that true ownership and control, they're brought into that center, right? And once that patient is engaged, many opportunities are unlocked where it was just unthinkable at times. And I think there's a real paradigm shift happening, not because of our great technologies, but that's because the patients are actually looking to be more of the CEO of their own health, I guess you could say. And the patients are driving this. The pandemic definitely drove this for decentralized trials. The pandemic definitely accelerated digital health, as we all say, by at least 5 years. Some people are even saying up to 10 years now. And so when we get together and we're talking about these specific use cases and what Chris was alluding to about, it's all about use cases, and he couldn't have said it better because, those use cases have to be, involved with the patient. You need to have some sort of patient engagement platform that allows that easy patient onboarding, consent, sharing of the data, the security, the privacy, all these things that we always all talk about on any presentations that we do. And more importantly, getting to the data sources. Traditionally, things would be collected by paper records, and it would take time for that to happen. Now there's new technologies where you can combine real-time instantaneous data, such as Seekster's technology, in addition to that paper trail manual retrieval method, which is still very, very valuable. I compare it to an example of the buffet table. Imagine we're all at a buffet table and you're hungry. You want to give some sort of, appetizer at the beginning, and then you go down and then you get, various different entrees. And then at the end, you fill it up with some desserts. You never do it backwards. And there's a reason for that, right? And so I think with patients and with trials, with payers, with providers, it doesn't matter what enterprise we're talking about, just healthcare in general, we need to be focused on how we deliver for the patient and in a timely manner. How do we do this so that they're in control? And how do we give them something very quickly while they're waiting to get the other pieces of the puzzle? I think this is where the industry is definitely headed. And a great example of that is, the big announcement from Datavant and Ciox just last week, right? Where, it just shows that there's validation about what we're talking about what we're trying to solve. And you can't forget about the patients.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's really one of the key focus of all of this is making it as easy as possible for more participants, more patients to be able to join in on research and then be able to capture this data, as passively, obviously, through consent, but really remove kind of that burdensome process that we currently have today. One of the key use cases that we see a lot would be in long-term follow-up studies, where it's required to receive a physician's release form from the patient on maybe every 6 months or every year, and then have to contact that patient on a yearly basis. It could be 10, 15 years. And then if that physician is the same, sending faxes or calling that physician to get this information back. But really what we see is that ability to tokenize the patient record and actually receive any of that pertinent information seamlessly as it occurs. So, over to Devin, on the Datavant side, can you talk a little bit about medical record and claims data and kind of what that process looks like and really how we can shift from, a highly manual process, burdensome process to more of a streamlined, automated one through patient data tokenization?
Yeah, definitely. So really what we're trying to do is just ensure researchers have the most complete picture of patient health for those patients that are enrolled in clinical trials as possible. So it's the type of medical data you mentioned, EHR and claims, but it's much more than that too. I think going forward, we're going to see a lot more with genetic tests, social determinants of health, mortality data, so on and so forth. But really, kind of by making that data available at the patient level, this means that sponsors, researchers are getting a much deeper view of the patients who are actually enrolled to their studies, and can kind of understand the entirety of all of the influencing factors of patient health. So in practice, what we're doing at Datavant, what we're doing at Medable, is really bringing our ecosystem of data partners who are already capturing, aggregating, structuring, and ultimately providing linkable healthcare information for the sponsors that we work with. So, you brought up claims and EHR. This would sort of be represented by a mix of health systems, insurers, EHR software providers, analytics companies that all deal with these medical records. So essentially what they're doing is they're using Datavant to de-identify and encrypt this information, which actually makes it linkable back to sponsored data for a clinical trial that, say, AbbVie is running. So that AbbVie can then pull from those sources, link it to the exact patients that enroll their patients, and have a more comprehensive understanding of the entire patient story. You mentioned long-term follow-up. That's probably one of the more compelling use cases for sure. So a use case that jumps to mind and one that we supported was one of the COVID-19 vaccines. Within the clinical development of that, patients were consented and they were tokenized as part of the study. And now what the sponsor can do is actually utilize medical records, claims data to do longer term follow-up to understand, what is the efficacy of these vaccines, not just 3 months after the fact, but 6 months, 2 years, and so on. And you can also do stuff, for instance, like set up and monitor adverse events, safety events of interest, et cetera. So, it's something that we're seeing more and more of, and pretty excited about. I know I've seen questions from several folks. Here's one from Eric about dealing with typical concerns from real world data, real world evidence. Our role is we're trying to help push the entire field forward here. There's a number of parties that are at play in terms of aggregating this important healthcare information and then making it ultimately usable. I'd say from curious to get Chris's take, but from the sponsor's approach, it's more data is typically good, but it can also get a little somewhat messy. So in some cases, people are just looking for nice structured data, maybe in a diagnosis code that helps them better understand, how do patients continue after the trial might come to its natural completion.
The one thing I would add to that is, people say that folks want more access to data. I think that what I would flip that and say that actually what people really want is more access to information. I think when you find yourself giving access to raw data to many folks, that tends to go a bit over their head. So I think that even when it comes to all stakeholders, whether it be pharma, providers, patients, whomever, generally what they want is better information that would be insightful to drive decision making. And it just happens to be that in sort of in the background, we're accessing more data types that would inform the context and allow for much more informed decision making. One of the questions that seem to have come through on the Q&A as I'm just perusing through it is around the sort of combination of clinical trial data and real world evidence. And generally what I would tell people is that is the expectation. It's viewed as complementary. It's not viewed as either or. I think that there will always be a place for conducting clinical trials. I think where we're looking at is that, is it the most appropriate mechanism in all cases? And I think that's proven to not be true, right? I think that there are situations where conducting an RWE-based trial is more appropriate and more efficient, more effective. And so in those cases where it is very appropriate to use a clinical trial, there's also some advantages to utilizing real-world evidence to get insight into sort of the performance of a therapy in a real-world context. And that comes out and maybe even in the form of a pragmatic clinical trial. So I wouldn't view it as that you have to make a decision as to you're going to take the red pill or blue pill. I think that you can do both. It just depends on the question you're trying to answer, the particular population you're looking to study, and whatever the clinical condition is.
Yeah, and I'd like to also add on that, follow up with, it's got to be the right type of data, right? It's not just data. It's the right type, the right kind. And there's a question from the audience around standardization and harmonization of data. At Seekster, what we've done is we've standardized and harmonized all the ICD-9 and ICD-10 and SNOMED codes and all of the terminology, not just on the medical data front, but if you take even your wearable, if you have an Apple Watch as an example, and let's say a Garmin, one says biking, the other one says cycling. And so, from an informatics standpoint, standardizing and normalizing all this data and presenting it in an intuitive way is so very important. And we need high quality data in order to have those actionable insights that Chris was talking about. It is so important. And so now hopefully the audience sees how this all kind of interconnects. Again, the patient being at the center, looking for the right type and right quality of data, having that all standardized and harmonized, and presenting that in a way to both researchers as well as the patients so that they're not overwhelmed. And there's various ways of doing that.
Absolutely. And I think one key point here, I see another question from the audience, really is around, in practical terms, how do we get access, or how would we get access to this patient data? And, really the answer to that is, through that consenting process, we can include a, optional sub-consent. So we're kind of on the clinical trial section of the program today. So within a clinical trial, we have the full study consent, and we could also include these sub-consents that potentially are optional for that health data linking or tokenization. So that's really, it's really a straightforward process from the patient side. It also provide the ability to opt out of that sub-consent down the line as well. So I don't know, Artie or Devin, if you have anything else you'd like to add there, but I just want to make sure we touch on that piece.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think I'm throwing out terms like tokenization, and I don't think that's a term that your typical patient's going to be familiar with. So it's really important to have a platform, a way of providing the appropriate information to explain in layman's terms what's actually happening here, how this data is going to be used, how it's not going to be used, how they can opt in, how they can opt out, et cetera. And having that patient consent, lets you do some important stuff too. Like Deborah just asked a question about how do you ensure real-world data from an EHR is actually accurate. So when you get consent, you're now going to, and you do something like tokenization, or you integrate with Seekster, you're going to be able to pull in these medical records from the EHR and find out information that you probably wouldn't have been privy to otherwise. So let's say a patient actually is admitted to the hospital and you found that out through the EHR data. Well, with the consent process, you can actually go back and dig into the records, have perhaps the site or a coordinator actually look into the notes and figure out, okay, what actually happened here? Is this perhaps relevant to our investigational therapy that the patient was on, or is this entirely separate? Or was it just a bad physician note that should have never been entered in the first place? With consent in place, you're able to be a little bit more flexible in how you go about understanding this information.
Yeah, and I think another great point there that Devin just talked about is, the fact that, it's the de-identified data. And someone asked the question of what's the differences between Datavant and Seekster. And we want to make sure that, two separate different technologies, two separate different, types of platforms. Think of it as a way of bringing de-identified data and identifiable data through the consent, exactly what Devin was just stating. And that convergence is really what we see being so powerful. And, it's not limited to any type of data source, And I think another part with one of the questions that Devin was answering from Datavant's side that relates to Seekster as well is, how do you know where it's coming from? Well, through the technology, it's chain of custody of data that's flowing directly from that Cerner, Allscripts, Epic, Meditech, McKesson. It's time-stamped, actually, from that EMR provider that is powering that health institution. So, for example, if there's, a patient that has, data at MD Anderson, Dana-Farber, UCSF, Stanford, NYU, and let's say they're a cancer patient, if we use the cancer use case, how do they rapidly, going back to Chris's slides at the beginning of the presentation, how do they rapidly actually access all that data? How do they bring it together? How do we reduce that patient burden? And a lot of that patient burden actually, I think everyone in this audience who's joined this call knows, it's actually the time of collection to data. And I go back to the buffet table. You want to give them something right away. At the same time, that's not the overall picture of all the pieces of data. So you have to use various different manual methods to retrieve that data, and maybe that comes in a couple weeks later. But I think this complementary way of de-identifying with the identifiable data upon the consent, and when you use, Medable for certain screenings, such as, their big COVID-19 screenings that they've done, this is where, these three technologies together is just a home run. And for the patient, for the enterprise, and for the results at the end of the day, right? So that's what really excites us.
Absolutely. And, so many great questions from the audience. Please, keep these coming. But we're going to shift gears a little bit and actually go into, our next case study, which would be HEOR. So, Chris, how do you feel, health economics research has changed over the past 5, 10, 15 years? And, where do you kind of see this going into the future?
That is a very sort of fascinating question. The first thing I would probably respond to is that when people think of HEOR, they're limiting it to just the sort of HE or health economics side of the house. There's very much an OR, an outcomes research angle to HEOR, and you can see just fundamentally how the space or the discipline itself is evolving across life sciences and pharma and medical device and other groups as the organization looks to these particular functions to do more with certainly with now that there's more data and being generated at just such a rapid pace. I think when I think about the evolution of HEOR itself, and I actually, it's funny that you asked me this question because I actually got the same question from my boss literally 2 weeks ago, and we were just talking about just sort of the evolution of a discipline that is relatively young compared to sort of other functions within the biopharma company. And then and you really think about it, the formation of HEOR really didn't happen and really wasn't solidified until the 90s, roughly the mid 90s. And even then, it was pretty much limited to just mostly cost-effective analyses as people really tried to understand resource allocation, and they really tried to understand, okay, let's weigh pros and cons with using this particular intervention. And that was just not for drugs, but it was for anything, right? And so that was really kind of how the space was initially formed in life sciences. Then you somewhat fast forward, roughly 5 to 10 years, then you have sort of the establishment of these sort of centralized HTA groups across the globe. Not necessarily in the U.S. The U.S. was different, right? Because our entire healthcare system was different and certainly much more fragmented and sector-based. But then that became the vehicle where it really just became a discussion around value. And that really started to come up, started to hear the concept around value-driven care, and really started, but people were really careful as to how they really framed what value meant. And in many cases, they never framed what value meant. I think when you fast forward to where we are today, I think people think of it in terms of, clinical, economic, and certainly humanistic and societal value, and from the eyes of the patient. But even then, you start to go a layer below that, then it really gets hairy, because then you have the notion of death panels and things that people have conjured up when they think about this term of value and in terms of HEOR. But I think what you see now is how it's shifted from being much more of a health economics sort of base discipline to being much more of I would say much more of an outcomes-based, but I think a function that is certainly looking at all data types to tell a story around the value of a particular therapy, and that becomes in those sort of various perspectives that I just outlined, whether they be clinical, economic, humanistic, and societal. And it's not in defense of a therapy, more or less, than it is around, honestly, let's weigh the pros and cons of this therapy and what it could actually do to the clinical outcome of this patient population. So I think what you've seen in the evolution of HEOR is certainly an evolution of its remitted purpose, an evolution of the skill sets necessary to do the work that we do, and also an evolution of the types of data that we looked at. To your point you have on the slide, it was very much claims data as a primary data source initially. And now we're looking at data sources that we've never looked at before, which requires us to engage with partners such as yourself to look at data types differently than we've ever looked before, to really kind of formulate questions that we've never had to answer before. So I think there's so much disruption happening in the space. It certainly can be a competitive advantage to companies if they're thinking about it in the right way and they're structuring themselves accordingly. But I think HEOR itself, and that's why you see some companies even rebranding the function, because it's just different now.
Absolutely. And, with the increase in the amount of data or data sources, has that been a good thing overall? Have you seen challenges with that? Sometimes having more data may, provide a kind of a different solution or different process. And, how do you think we can further optimize, through these additional data sources as well as maybe even analytics tools?
So I think the late great Biggie Smalls said, "More data, more problems." You'll hear the we have more. So no, he said more money, more problems. But actually, in this case, it is more data, more problems. But in a good way. I think that access to more data gives us more insights. It goes back to the original sort of discussion point of really being able to formulate the right questions and having the right skill and people to be able to utilize these data in meaningful ways. There's been such, now I think the new wave is how do you link these data, and actually we were just talking about tokenization, which I think is interesting, which can now become, 5 years ago, tokenization was like this extremely technical word, and that's become a big buzzword almost. I still don't think most people understand what it means, but they do throw it out casually in conversation. I think the ability to now that we have all these different these novel data sources that are available, the question is, how do you link it to better understand certainly the patient experience in a meaningful way? I mean, we're exploring ways of trying to link phenotypic and genomic data. Obviously, I think many people are. Obviously now you layer in the social determinants data and all that entails and how you make sense of that. But I do think all these things are now pertinent to many of the key decision makers, whether they be payers, policymakers, and providers, and patient groups, and everyone wants all these things to be considered as we think about clinical outcomes. That is the driver, right? The discussion is really around certainly value and access, but it's really around positive clinical outcomes and understanding what's driving that. And it does take all of this different data in order to better understand that. No longer just EHR data, that won't be sufficient. Claims data is definitely not sufficient, but all of these data is relevant.
Definitely. Yeah, I think, across the industry, we see that having access to more data, like you said, more data and more problems, but really it's a much better problem to have than the alternative of not actually having that data to inform the decisions in the first place. So next, maybe we go over to Artie and then Devin. Where do you see use cases for both of your platforms in terms of kind of leading this next generation of health economics and outcomes research?
Yeah, look, health economics and outcomes research. Health economics and outcomes research is a positive feedback loop, and I think making clinical trials more efficient. How do we really do that and effective? And by staying, again, connected, I bring it back to the patient. By staying connected to the patients, valuable data can be collected in real time over decades now. And, long-term study follow-up and HEOR benefits from that real-time data. I think it's really important to focus on how we static data, but real-time data. And again, going back to the longitudinal, follow-up studies, because if someone's on, a certain, let's say drug, and they have certain effects during, one phase and not another, how do you get that outcomes research? How do you get those outcomes results that Chris was? You have to measure impact over time. You have to have technology that enables that patient in order to do so. And so, it couldn't be better timing, I think, to talk about these certain use cases, but is definitely I would say another buzzword, but it is a very large use case. What are we exactly potential, morbidities that come from various different medications and what people are using. And not only that, a lot of the research has been done on European or white Caucasians. There's not any diverse data. Everyone's looking for that data lake, but we've all built the wrong data lakes to look at even. And so I think, pharma from our angle and all the conversations we're having is starting to look at diversity of data, is looking at that chain of custody data, those long-term studies. And they weren't able to do that. And so I think that's what's so exciting. Now it's slowly becoming possible.
A couple things come to mind for me, Tyler. One, for years, I've heard HR researchers make claims that, there's a holy grail, and that is, it varies over time, but it used to be incorporate EHR and economic data. Then, of course, genomic information got thrown in, and kind of like what Chris was alluding to. And a lot of this is possible for doing things like precision medicine, or for the best route to things like, value-based healthcare, for instance. And I think we're at the point where technologies like tokenization and data linking, where this holy grail is being realized. The other thing I'd add is that another thing, in terms of thinking about the future of HEOR type studies is we can actually do these studies on clinical trial populations now. So that's where a lot of our trial tokenization use cases actually fall under. It's HEOR scientists who are utilizing clinical trial patients to start to actually develop the case for reimbursement from payers much earlier in the clinical development process. So they can start to link in claims, economic information, and get a better understanding of the entire course of care for these patient populations. Instead of, more traditionally speaking, you have to wait until a drug goes onto the market, and then you can start to do these types of studies. It's helpful for everybody if you can do them earlier in the process and have a better understanding of these patient populations and their associated outcomes. And really, that sort of starts to blur the lines between, what's a clinical trial versus a pragmatic study versus real-world evidence. And, ultimately, I see that as a good problem to have.
Definitely.
So Devin agrees.
Quick time.
You hear that? He said more data, more problems. I think that's the recurring theme.
Yeah, that's what we'll leave you with today. Quick time check. We're under 10 minutes, but we definitely want to hit on the registry side of this. And I think it's really more generally looking at any type of phase 4 or long-term follow-up or registries, really with our goal and what we've seen over the past year or so with the acceleration in drug development, where we're able to get the COVID-19 vaccine approved in record time. One of the key aspects here is being able to follow up for more of those long-term outcomes, safety events through these large, diverse registries, which we see. This potentially could be some of the largest studies ever run. And I think my perspective would be that we continue to see that more in the future as we try to collapse the actual approval timelines. So in terms of registries, and when we think about data as well as patient burden, Devin, I'll go to you first. Do you think that, or do you see that the burden on patients as well as the cost to biopharma, has that improved at all in the past few years? Do you see that improving further into the future?
Yeah, I'd say the burden to conducting registries has decreased in some important ways. Traditionally, they've been designed very similar to a clinical trial. You recruit, you enroll, you collect the relevant data over time, and you accomplish your goals, be it understanding a certain patient population or, monitoring a therapy's safety, et cetera. However, registries, they've also been the early adopters in utilizing various types of real-world data, real-world evidence. So, for instance, EHR data has long been used in registry studies, as have things like patient-reported outcomes, social determinants of health, and so on and so forth. But what we're doing with tokenization is really unlocking opportunities to more consistently use this type of data. And I think we've seen registries sort of be the foremost adopters of these technologies. So, again, in practice, here's what that actually looks like. A patient's enrolled to a registry. They're consented to having their real-world data linked to the registry so the sponsor or the researcher can better understand their course of care. And then this unlocks all sorts of optionality. So the researchers can now link in claims, lab genetic, wearable data, whatever might be of interest, and link it back to those patients. And that data will now be included as part of the actual registry data sets.
Great. And Artie, maybe your perspective on this, what can we still do, even further to make registries even less burdensome, easy to participate in for patients, as well as further reduce those costs when we start to look at not registries of 10,000 patients, but maybe it's of 100,000 patients or millions of patients. What do you see as terms of hitting scale there for wider, more diverse, and also increased participation?
Yeah, look, I think registries are the portals of clinical trials, actually. They can be greatly improved, number one, with better connectivity and patient centricity. And, I think they've struggled for some time, and not because of any reason, but because there weren't technologies that can actually empower the patient and the registry at the same time. You need seamless sign-up from the start. It's not just about having a patient registry. And we get calls all the time for folks now that are running just amazing rare disease registries, cancer registries, diabetic registries, and that wasn't happening before. And so I think they're all realizing, okay, we're a small piece of it, but we need technology in order to really empower the patient again, so the patients can see what it is valuable to them and join the future studies later on. That's what we're really seeing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we have about 5 minutes left, but I'm going to throw out kind of a wild card question. So I'm going to start with Chris, and same question to everybody, but 5 years from now, what do you think is the single most impactful thing that we can look back on that really improves the overall experience as well as data quality within research, whether that's in HEOR, standard interventional clinical trials, or in registries? Chris, to you first.
Oh man, that's a very loaded question. I think that my hope in 5 years, considering the pace of way things are moving and at the pace at which they're moving, I hope that we think about we're viewing clinical research and clinical care differently, and it's all powered by this sort of innovation that we're seeing happening in this sort of data collection, data storage, data curation, and the expanded use of these other novel data sources to inform the sort of narrative around the clinical experience. I hope that we're at a place where, the whole notion of access to clinical trials and thus access and better understanding of these various subpopulations and the access to therapies is much better than it is right now. I think that the pandemic only put a spotlight on an issue that we know has been there for a very, very long time. And it's certainly beyond, I think that the unfortunate piece is during the pandemic too, the narrative has been that when it comes to the lack of diversity in clinical trials, for example, that it's mostly a reticence from certain subpopulations to be part of it. And to me, that's not an acceptable explanation for not expanding the access to all populations when it comes to doing some of the clinical research that we've done. So I hope that there are solutions that address that access issue. I think that the usage of decentralized trials or virtual trials is probably one of the strongest solutions I've seen in quite some time. I hope that we start to incorporate more of the patient voice and the patient context into much of what we're seeing on the clinical research side of the house, which means those very novel social determinants of data, social determinants of health data sources are more effectively utilized. I hope that we start to get smarter in how we think about the utility of all these various data and certainly define much better what use cases that are very patient-centric and patient-focused can certainly move us further along than where we are right now. We can't emphasize, we talked very surface level about some of these challenges that we see within clinical trials. The issues are certainly much more systemic than that. And I think that, unfortunately, we're seeing patients that are dying unnecessarily because we aren't able to, develop drugs or better understand the response and non-response rates to these therapies with certain populations. I think that we're seeing if we can get access to these therapies much faster. And again, I go back to the pandemic because to me, if there was ever a silver lining in the situation, the silver lining in that situation was that, we got a lot of problems that we need to fix in the system as it currently stands. But the other part of this is that we can fix them, right? I mean, there are solutions that are out there to address many of these systemic challenges if we're willing and we're focused on doing just that. So I hope 5 years from now, we're not having the same discussion that we're having today.
No doubt, no doubt. I mean, I absolutely love what you said about, not only increasing awareness where people feel comfortable, they they can learn about research in general, whether they participate or not. I think that's one of the things that really isn't totally available or maximized right now. And then the second piece is increasing that access so that people can participate anytime, anywhere, no matter what their work schedule is, their life schedule, where they live. Really some of the key aspects that we can do to increase participation generally, as well as increase diversity. So absolutely love that. And I think we're right over time, but Artie, Devin, any parting last couple comments? We had so many questions come in. Yeah. It's just running over.
Yeah, look, I think we need to work together to make the big impact that Chris was talking about. And I'm very hopeful too that we'll get more diversity of data. And at the end of the day, patients will be more empowered and better medicine will come faster, cheaper, and we'll have a real healthcare system, because the healthcare system is very fragmented. The data is really fragmented. Everything we talked about is all about patient burden, and it relates to it. And hopefully we can, remove those barriers so that patients don't have the burdens that they have and the outcomes become much better, faster.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would just piggyback on that. I'd say we at DataVant, we call it data liquidity. And basically, in 5 years, we want to be in a world in which researchers and patients in a patient-centric way can get the right data when they need it, where they need it. And I think we have come a long ways, but we've got a long ways to go to get to realize that value.
Awesome. Well, we're at time. For everyone that joined us today, thank you so much. Great questions. We can follow up directly with those responses. Please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us individually. We'd be happy to set up calls to really dive into specific use cases even further. But again, thank you to the panel, Chris, Artie, Devin, amazing conversation, and thank you to all our attendees today.
Thanks for having us. Thanks, Tyler.
Thanks so much.
All right. Everyone have a good day. Thanks.